6 years ago, at the tender age of 29, I became the recipient of my granddad's home after he died. It was very surprising if I'm being honest, but the story goes that shortly before he died, he had his last will and testament amended so that my parents could get the majority of his money, while I received full ownership of his old Georgian townhouse. I think the idea was that since my parents already owned their own home, passing his house along to me was a way of getting me onto the property ladder nice and early. I appreciated the sentiment back then, and I appreciate it now. I still live in that house, and it's where I'm actually typing this right now. But when I first inherited it, it left me with something of a problem. I wasn't doing all that great financially at the time, and when you're no longer renting, there's no landlord to summon whenever anything goes wrong in your home. I learned very quickly when I was living somewhere above my pay grade, but in addition to taking on extra hours at work and fighting for a promotion, I needed some fast cash. And that, boys and girls, is how I became a very young and very hesitant landlord. It just so happened that the basement of my granddad's old house had some plumbing fixtures, and that, with a little bit of work, it could be turned into a single-bedroom flat. It would be a small one, just a kind of crash pad really, but I'd easily be able to advertise it for about 250 to 300 pounds a month, which would cover all my bills and council tax with a wee bit left over to spare. Doing the place up was a bit of an investment, and I put quite a bit of money of my granddad's inheritance into turning it into not just a livable space, but a pretty cozy one too. My philosophy was, if I wouldn't be excited to live there if I was a few years younger, then there was no way I was about to ask upwards of $250 a month for it. I wanted a few extra quid, not to become a single property slumlord, and I thought that a nicer property would attract nicer tenants. I'd like to think that I was right about that too, because my first tenant was this lovely master's student. But then, with all the lockdowns hitting at that point, and as we all know, that changed a lot of people's financial situations dramatically. My lovely master's student had to move out, and it might sound a bit silly, but losing that $250 a month was quite a big hit to my pocketbook. I was home all the time, so my bills went up, and with it being COVID, I just couldn't find anyone to move in, since everyone was basically paralyzed by all the restrictions. Things only started to loosen up again around Christmas time, and by that point, I was absolutely desperate for a tenant. Then after putting up a round of fresh ads on various rental websites, I got an application from a guy called Stefan. Stefan wasn't his actual name, but he was a youngish Romanian guy, so I've just picked a random Romanian name to keep it anonymous and for reasons that become obvious as the story progresses. Stefan seemed shy and quite artsy, but aside from that, that's all I really knew about him. A lot of landlords will ask for proof of earnings and from foreign nationals, a copy of their visa and all of that. But me, all I was interested in is if Stefan could pay the deposit in his first month's rent up front. That'd have covered me over the Christmas period, and if I had issues with Stefan afterwards, then so be it. But he paid the next month and the next, and by his 4th or 5th month of living in the basement, I was more than happy to extend his 6-month contract to an indefinite one. I had zero idea of what Stefan did for a living. All I knew is that he traveled into Edinburgh a lot and he paid the rent on time. Everything else was none of my business. I also have to emphasize just how quiet Stefan was. Half the reason I knew nothing about him was because we never saw each other. Occasionally on the 1st of the month, he'd just slip an envelope full of cash through my letterbox, and that's the most interacting I'd do with him for a whole month. I didn't think he was actively trying to avoid me. I just thought that that was his way. He was out a lot, never played any loud music, and he always paid the rent on time. In many ways, he was a dream tenant, but then around month 7 or 8, so late summer of 2021, I started noticing some increasingly weird things. The first was that Stefan seemed to be getting an awful lot of deliveries to his flat. The entrance to his flat was just outside my living room window, and one morning, I saw a delivery truck at the end of the drive, while Stefan was signing for something in a large cardboard pallet. It looked like IKEA furniture or something, and he caught my eye as he carried it back to his door, but I just gave him a wave and that was that. Another weird thing about Stefan was that whenever we did bump into one another, he sometimes just wouldn't return my greeting. I'd say, "Morning, Stefan," or ask, "You alright, Stefan?" And he'd just look at me in acknowledgement, but never reply. The first few times I just thought that he was a bit shy or something, but then it got to the point where I thought that it might be a kind of language barrier thing. The Scottish accent isn't the easiest to understand, and like I said, I put it down to a bit of communication barrier thing at first. But after a while, I started thinking something was a bit weird about Stefan. I know that he wasn't obligated to talk to me or anything, it's just something that I look back on now and think, yeah, maybe I should have paid a bit more attention to that. But anyway, back to the deliveries, there was a time when he was getting one day, and he'd mostly hang around to sign for them himself, but then one day, something arrived for him and he wasn't there to sign for it. The delivery man then knocks on my door and asks if I'll take care of it for the tenant. I tell him no problem, sign for the item, then I discover it's another large flat cardboard package, so big I needed the help of the delivery guy to get it safely into my hallway without dropping it. I keep it in my house until I see Stefan coming home later on that evening, and I give a shout to let him know that I've got his package. Instead of thanking me or whatever, he looked almost panicked and immediately asked me if I'd opened it in a very accusatory fashion. I was taken aback a bit, told him no, I hadn't looked at his package, and if I'm being honest, I resented the accusation a wee bit. I told him as such too, not in an aggressive way, but just to make it clear that I wasn't that kind of landlord or that kind of bloke. And he seemed to calm down after that and mumbled something about the contents being expensive. That was the last time I saw or spoke to Stefan before the incident. But before then, there was one more thing that had my concern mounting prior to that big incident. One day I nipped down to the local high street to get a few pints of milk. It's a short walk, 10 minutes there, 10 minutes back, but then as I'm returning with my bottles of milk, I see someone walk into the driveway of my house. It definitely wasn't Stefan, so I sped up my walk a wee bit just to see who it was and what they wanted. When I got to my driveway, I saw this bloke, light-colored jacket and red hair, and he just sort of was staring at my house while walking slowly up the drive. I asked him, "Can I help you?" And he almost jumped out of his skin before turning around to look at me. I was trying to be as friendly as I could, but I was still a bit wary of this bloke, because he's both randomly on my property and he's acting all anxious and nervous, which to me was not a good sign. I started to back off a bit, asking him if we had a problem, and he used the space that I gave him to dart down the driveway and suddenly out of sight. I walked out into the street to try and see where he'd ran off to, but when I looked, he was nowhere to be seen. I called the police, just so that they had something logged. I wasn't overreacting and demanding a visit from any officers. I was just letting them know in case it happened again, at which point they'd know that it was an ongoing thing and therefore a more urgent situation. Anyway, I get that logged, and then not long after, Stefan comes home, and just on a whim, I decided to tell him about the weird bloke in the driveway, just so he was forewarned if it happened again. I caught him in the driveway, told him about the bloke, and immediately he starts acting a bit cagey. The way I see it, if Stefan didn't know him, he'd have acted as uninterested in me as he usually did. But he didn't. He actually stopped and conversed with me, as much as Stefan was capable of anyway. I started telling him what the guy looked like, and there was this definite look of recognition in his eyes, despite his attempts to hide it. But then I asked if he knew the guy, or if there was anything I needed to know about him. Stefan shook his head and then carried on towards the basement. I was a bit annoyed, to be honest. I could tell that he was lying when he shook his head, but then again, what was I going to do? Interrogate him? If he didn't want to tell me, he wasn't going to tell me. And the best I could do was make it clear that I'd be calling the police again if there was any unwelcome visits, and that it'd be a lot less likely if I knew who he was. I felt like that was me giving Stefan a soft out, so to speak. Just tell me who it is, and why he's hanging around, and I'll try not to get him nicked. But again, he just nods and sort of walks off, like he doesn't want to tell me. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't over. I just had a feeling. This guy had come looking for Stefan, and I was almost sure of it. It was just a question of why. He didn't seem dangerous or anything. I wasn't exactly scared. I was just a bit uneasy about some stranger creeping around my property when I wasn't around. Anyway, a few weeks go by and there's no sign of our skittish ginger friend at all, so I start to basically forget his visit ever occurred at all. And Stefan had obviously dealt with the situation because the old ginger bloke hadn't showed up again. And if he hadn't dealt with him and the ginger visitor had simply lost interest, well, it had all worked out the same way anyway, hadn't it? So then, one Friday evening, I once again nipped down to the pub to see a few old pals of mine. I only went for 1 or 2 pints, as it was a last-minute invite, but then more and more of my old mates started showing up, so I stayed out later and later until, admittedly, I was at least 2/3 pished, and by that time I came to my senses and headed home before closing. Like I said, I'm a bit worse for the wear, so I popped my headphones in, listened to a few tunes on the way back, and I'm almost certain that I was singing along by the time I got to my driveway. In fact, I know that I was singing because I was on exactly the 3rd verse of Glenn Campbell's Southern Nights by the time I got to my living room, took out my earbud things, and then tried to fire the old Bluetooth to my speakers so I could carry on with my one-man karaoke night. But then, in the little window of silence between the song going from my headphones to my speakers, I heard something else that caught my attention. I thought I was going mad at first, so I paused the music and stood there in silence, just straining my eyes until I realized what it was. It was the sound of music coming from the basement. For the first time ever, Stefan was playing music so loud that I could actually hear it. Come to think of it, that was the first time I'd ever heard Stefan do anything at all, and I assumed that he was only playing his music that loud because he thought that I was going to be out all night, which, to be fair, isn't completely out of the ordinary for me. I could hear the sort of bassy thump of his music, some sort of EDM kind of beat, so I thought that he might have been having a sort of party. I didn't have a problem with it, but his wee basement flat didn't even have room to swing a cat, let alone have an actual shindig. I suppose I was feeling a bit sociable, so I walked out into the driveway and peered over the railings to where his little kitchen window was. I know that's a bit of an intrusion, but I was drunk, curious, and honestly wanted to carry on the party a wee bit, so off I went. But when I looked, I couldn't see anyone in Stefan's small kitchen, meaning that it must have been quite a small gathering confined to the bedroom, which was probably the most spacious room in the flat. I was feeling like a right perv by that point, so I took myself off back inside, turned up my own music, and then went into the kitchen to make myself some drunk food. I'm doing my thing in the kitchen, but I'm still thinking about Stefan and his little party going on downstairs. I knew next to nothing about the bloke, and assuming that he wasn't just blasting that music down there on his own, I was happy that he finally had some social life. I definitely didn't want to be the creepy landlord trying to interject myself into his personal life either, so I resigned myself to having one last beer with my food and then headed off to bed. So I microwaved some chicken drumsticks, grabbed a final beer from the fridge, and then watched a bit of trash TV as I'm eating. Then when I'm all done, I wash up, go back to the TV room, and turn everything off. Now once again, I'm standing there in silence, and I can hear that same thump, thump, thump of Stefan's dance music from downstairs. But then, that time, it was accompanied by another much less rhythmic noise that sounded an awful lot like someone shouting. It was one voice, that much was clear, but after kneeling down and putting my ear closer to the floorboards, I realized that it sounded more like screaming. And that's the point when I had this real uh-oh kind of moment, one that was probably slowed down from how smashed I still was. But it eventually dawned on me that I had to go down to Stefan's flat and see if everything was okay, because whoever was screaming down there was obviously in a huge amount of distress, and they weren't shutting up anytime soon. I ran outside, rushed down the stairs to Stefan's flat, and then when I listened, I could still hear the screaming. I knew it was urgent, seriously urgent, so I started calling out, "Stefan, I'm gonna break in, hang on." And then, that's what I did. I kicked at his door over and over again, nearly going arse over tit a few times, but I got that door open. The man was still screaming when the door flew open, and that music was still going too, but I could barely hear it at all. I was that fixated on those horrible screams. There was no one in Stefan's wee kitchen and dining area, so the only place left to look was the bedroom, which was also where the music and the screams were coming from. So I rushed towards the bedroom, peered around the threshold, and the first thing that drew my attention was the man who was screaming. He was sitting with his back against the bedroom wall, knees pulled up to his chest, and I didn't see it at first, but he was attached to the wall by something that was around his neck. It was short, keeping him low and close to the wall, basically forcing him into the position that he was in, and when he saw me, we locked eyes. For the briefest of moments, something about his eyes seemed oddly similar to me, and then once again, all I could hear were those screams. After he'd spotted me, instead of just wordless screaming, he started begging me in these screeches to get it off me, please get it off me. I would have done it too, I really would have. I had no idea what was going on, but I was terrified for the bloke right up until I saw Stefan on the other side of the room. He was lying there, not a stitch of clothing on him, with more blood than I've ever seen in my life pooled around underneath, and the handle of what I assumed was a knife sticking out of his stomach. So much blood was soaked into the carpet that it looked thick like mud, and his eyes were wide open. I mean wide open, like he'd passed out with this shocked look on his face. In an instant, the screaming man's plea to get it off of him wasn't nearly so appealing anymore. I assumed that if I did get that neck restraint thing off of him, he was going to do to me what he'd just done to Stefan, and as you can imagine, I didn't fancy that at all. So instead of doing what he was begging me to do, I just bolted out of the flat, up the stairs, and back into my house before calling the police. Then, while I was on the phone with them, I realized why the screaming man had seemed so oddly familiar to me. It was the ginger guy I'd seen walking up my driveway a few weeks prior. It had to be him, I was sure of it, and I've never had that confirmed, but I'm bloody sure that it was him. Anyway, I was up in my house, basically screaming down the phone to 999 to get police and paramedics out to me as fast as they possibly could. I didn't know if Stefan was actually dead or not. He bloody well looked like it, but I know paramedics can work wonders if they get to a person in time, so I made it clear how urgently they were needed. There are two things from that phone call that really stuck with me. The first was that the operator stayed so calm throughout the whole thing to the point that it sounded really bizarre to me. For example, I remember telling her, "There's someone tied up down there. There's something around his neck," and she repeated in the most monotone voice, "There's someone tied up. Is there? Okay. Is the injured person still breathing?" She said it back to me like it was nothing, like it was the most boring thing she'd ever heard. Then she went right back to her job of assessing the situation at hand. I know she was just doing her job and that it speaks volumes of how unflappably brave our 999 operators are, but in the moment, it made me a little bit angry. It also made me angry that she asked me to go back downstairs to take another look at Stefan. The last thing in the world I wanted to do was go back down there to see all those things and hear that guy's screams again. I kept telling her, "No way, I'm not going back down there," mainly because I'm still very much under the impression that the ginger bloke down in the basement was the one who stabbed Stefan. Only when I made it clear that it was dangerous down there, potentially anyway, did the operator relent, and she told me to wait in a safe area inside my house until the police showed up. By that time, I couldn't hear any more screaming coming from downstairs, but I could still hear the music, and God help me, I wish I'd turned it off when I had the chance to. The police turned up quite quickly. It felt like a lot longer than it actually was, but to their credit, they only took around 10 minutes to get out to me. I directed them down into the basement flat, and they made sure the guy who had been screaming was safe but secured. Then the paramedics arrived not long after to do what they could, but it was too late for Stefan. I actually thought that he might have had a chance at the time because none of the paramedics mentioned anything about him being dead, and they still looked like they were trying to save his life when they put him in the back of the ambulance. It was only later when some police officers told me a murder investigation had been opened, and that's when it really sunk in that Stefan was gone. The flat downstairs went from being a nice little earner to being an active crime scene for about 10 days afterwards. The police had the whole circus out. Forensics, CID, social workers. They were in and out at all hours, and that was all after extensive interviews with me, and I'm assuming interviews with that ginger guy too. They also took away all the weird contraptions in Stefan's bedroom, which is something I should have mentioned earlier. There were all these things, like exercise equipment, but it looked more like something you'd use to torture someone. I'm assuming that's what was going on anyway, some kind of party or game that went wrong, and I'm also assuming that's what Stefan was having delivered all that summer. It certainly explained why he didn't want me to see what was inside his packages. Obviously, I mentioned all this to the police during the interviews, and I kept in touch with the 2 detectives who were responsible for working on the case, and that's how I found out that he was probably going to get off with manslaughter, and that's if the CPS even brought charges against him at all. According to the man himself, the ginger bloke I mean, they'd been playing a kind of game when Stefan had produced a knife out of nowhere. He was restrained and terrified, but his legs were free, so he kicked out at Stefan, who went tumbling back, and he fell on his own knife, he said. The CID guy I spoke to said the story matched the crime scene, and it's not like the guy could have arranged it that way, considering he was basically bolted to the wall. It sounded like an open and shut self-defense thing to me, but then apparently it all depended on what the prosecution service said, and obviously I wasn't privy to that decision or what happened to the ginger guy in the end. I also have no idea what happened to Stefan's body, if it was taken back to Romania or if he had family there to receive it. The only time I asked, the detective told me that he had no idea, and how all that was down to the Foreign Office and had nothing to do with the police. The last time I spoke to the detective was the last time I heard anything about Stefan's death, and now I'm left being the owner of a home in which someone has been murdered. I'm not proud of it, and I certainly don't advertise it. And I don't believe in ghosts, but some of my tenants might, and that's half the reason I'm not putting any major details into this. People say sometimes I sound like I feel sorry for Stefan, which I suppose sounds crazy if it really was about the murder of the wee ginger guy, slaughterhouse style, right there in my basement. But if I'm being honest, I do think it was just like a weird roleplay thing that went horribly, horribly wrong. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself, so I don't consider myself in any sort of danger for all that time with a wannabe Jeffrey Dahmer living right beneath my feet. Back in the late 80s, around the time my first son was born, I used to work for quite a large property management company in Seattle. We managed about 100 to 150 apartments and rental homes at any one time, and my team was charged with scheduling and carrying out viewings for potential tenants. I had quite a large team under me, and we were very close-knit, which made what happened in the fall of '89 that much harder to bear. I worked with a team of very talented young men and women, but perhaps one of the brightest I ever worked with was a young lady named Vicky. Vicky was by far the best talent we had on staff during the fall of '89. She could close almost anything. I used to put her on viewings of a place we'd been having trouble filling, and within a few days, Vicky had us a tenant. The same applied to the more highbrow properties too, where an empty unit meant thousands in lost revenue every month. I'd put Vicky on it, and then lo and behold, we'd have a tenant within weeks, sometimes days if the market was right. So, when I got a call regarding one of our 6-figure executive apartments in one of the new high-rises downtown, I knew Vicky was the right girl for the job. The place was probably one of the most expensive properties in our portfolio, and it had been empty for almost 3 months at the time, so filling it would be a huge win for both my team and the company as a whole. So on the day of the viewing, I gave Vicky a call in the morning to make sure the appointment was still scheduled, then wished her the very best of luck. Not that she needed it, but I always found it best to create as positive an environment as possible, especially when it came to sales prospects. Then after hanging up the phone, I simply waited until the early afternoon to hear back from her on how it went. The viewing was scheduled for 1:15 p.m., so I expected it to be over at around 1:40 to 1:45 at the latest. After that, it was a short trip back to the office, and we'd find out if she'd sealed the deal or not. But then, 2 p.m. comes and goes, and there's no sign of Vicky. Then 2:30 comes and goes, and there's still no sign of her. We go from excited to hear from her to impatient to downright worried, so we tried calling her at home, but there was no answer. Eventually, it came to the end of office hours, and we still hadn't heard from Vicky, so I assured the girls that I'd keep on calling her out of office hours, and that I'd let them know what I'd uncovered as soon as I uncovered it. I know that might seem like something of an overreaction, but it was so completely unlike Vicky to just go AWOL like that, and we just knew something had to be wrong. So I got home, and I kept on calling Vicky's home address every half hour or so. I must have left like 3 different messages on her machine, just asking her to call me back, when my phone finally rang at around 10 that night. I picked up, fighting off the urge to ask Vicky as soon as I did, but I might as well have asked her name because it was her, and the sense of relief that I felt at first was gigantic. I'd gotten it into my head that she'd been hit by some kind of medical emergency, so just to hear her voice and for her to tell me that she was fine was a huge relief. But then I could hear in her voice that she was not fine. She just meant that she was okay physically. Mentally, on the other hand, that was clearly a different thing entirely. I remember telling her that she didn't have to tell me what happened. I just needed to know how long she needed to recover. But I also said that if she did want to tell me what happened, if she wanted to tell me something, I could pass it on to the rest of the team, then I was okay with that too. She told me everything. How she'd been talking to the police for the last few hours, how she felt like she needed a few days off, but no more than that. But most importantly, she told me the reason she talked to the cops and the reason she needed those days off to recover. And it all started with that afternoon viewing. We were all expecting some kind of high roller to show up to the viewing, as, like I'd already mentioned, the apartment in question was priced at thousands of dollars per month. So when a very average-looking Joe showed up and introduced himself as the prospective tenant, Vicky said that she was a little taken aback. Obviously, you can never judge a book by its cover, especially when it comes to real estate. I've known a lot of very healthy buyers to dress like crap, and so had Vicky, so she knew to turn on the charm all the same and give him the 5-star treatment she'd give someone in a 3-piece brioni. The man was unshaven, wearing an all-waterproof jacket, faded jeans, and dirty sneakers. But Vicky said that he greeted her very confidently and purposefully, and so she simply continued with the viewing as usual. The apartment in question was 1 or 2 above the 20th floor. It was either the 21st or 22nd, I can't quite remember, but Vicky takes him up there and makes a little small talk along the way. The guy said he worked in computers, which actually made a whole lot of sense, and would have made a whole lot of sense to just about any property manager or realtor at the time. About 10 years prior, 2 computer nerds moved from New Mexico to Seattle and established a little company known as Microsoft. And 10 years later, Seattle was practically flooded with all kinds of computer types, and a fair share of them had a big old chunk of change in their pocket once the companies started to really take off. I'm telling you this to make it clear that by the time they got to the apartment, whatever reservations Vicky had about the man's style of dress had completely dissipated, as they would have done if that were me doing the tour instead. They got to the apartment, and the guy's asking her a lot of financial questions. What are the monthly utilities estimated to be? Does the company offer a rent-to-buy program, and if so, what kind of time scale and value projections would he be looking at? Vicky trying her best to keep up with the guy, but he clearly knew what he was talking about. She couldn't just dazzle him with the kitchen island or the huge floor-to-ceiling windows. He wanted cold, hard figures. So, Vicky being Vicky, she sets about giving them to him, and where she can't, she just gives estimates that are both optimistic and enticing as possible. But then all the same, the guy starts checking out the big floor-to-ceiling windows and gazing out over what was potentially his own personal vista of Seattle. Vicky said that she asked him if he liked the view, and he replied by asking if the windows opened. Vicky then explained that they did, via a hinge on the other side of the large pane center. You can open all 4 windows at any one time, with the bottom leaning towards you and the top leaning away. The fixtures were very strong, and the glass was tempered and shatterproof, and it meant the apartment was pretty much off limits to anyone with small children. A person could also quite easily squeeze themselves through the small gap if they really wanted to, but then who would ever do such a thing? Vicky mentioned almost all of that to the viewer, who replied that he didn't have any children, so the windows wouldn't be an issue. But then he looks at Vicky with this sort of sly smile and says, "But someone as small as you could fit under there pretty easy, right?" Vicky said she thought it was a poor attempt at humor, so she returned a polite laugh, then made a comment about how she'd never be in that situation. And I'm with her in that. If those windows were open, I'd always keep 10 feet away at all times. I'm a real fraidy cat when it comes to heights, you see, and I'm a 250-pound lump that'd have to run a couple of marathons before being able to even fit through that gap. But then, in response to Vicky's comment about never being in that position, the man replied, "But what if someone forced you into that position?" Vicky was a gem, but she was no pushover, so she politely informed the viewer that she didn't appreciate his style of humor, and would be grateful if he refrained from making such jokes. But he starts telling her, oh, it's not a joke, and that if he really wanted to, he could force her down and shove her through the gap, sending her hurtling down hundreds of feet onto the concrete below. Vicky said that she felt her blood run cold, not just at what he'd said, but because of the way he said it too. He didn't say it with this deadpan expression. He said it like it was the most amusing idea that he had in a while, and I guess it amused him so much because it put the fear of God into Vicky. She said she started backing up away from him, and instinctually looked over towards the door, but that only prompted the viewer to close the gap between them, and assure her that any attempt to escape would be useless. Vicky reminded the guy that we had his name and contact details, but this only caused him to erupt into laughter. He asked if she really thought that he was that stupid, that he'd use his real name to book a viewing where he'd planned on murdering the realtor. Then, upon seeing the expression on her face, the guy started laughing and insulting her, calling her a stupid bee, and saying how she was so much dumber than she looked. Vicky said that that was the point that she got really scared. She said she raised her foot, took off her heel, then kicked off the other before brandishing the first as a weapon. She kept on backing up, ready to at least to try and defend herself. But this time, the guy didn't try and follow her. He just kept on laughing, even harder too when he saw how afraid she was. Vicky hadn't been in that apartment before, and she'd already made a note of where the bedroom and bathroom were. So she knew that with each step that she took away from the viewer meant that she was one step closer to being able to lock herself in the bathroom. And so that's what she did. She kept on treading backwards, telling him that he'd crack his head open if he tried to rush her. Luckily, that had the guy doubled over laughing, but Vicky said that she got this surge of adrenaline and knew that it was her moment to make a run for it. If she tried to go for the front door, there's no doubt that he'd catch her, as, like I've already mentioned, it was a very spacious apartment. But on the other hand, if Vicky rushed for the bedroom, and its ensuite bathroom with a thick lockable door, the guy would need superhuman speed to catch up with her in time. And that's what she did. She turned and ran to the bedroom and slammed the bathroom door behind her before turning the lock. She said that there was the obvious sense of relief from knowing that she had a nice thick door and a lock between her and that psycho. But then seconds later, something awful dawned on her, something the guy was so acutely aware of. He started mocking her again, laughing and saying things like, "You've trapped yourself. I can't wait out here all night." If this was a time when cell phones were common, this wouldn't have been a problem. But all Vicky had was a simple beeper, or pager as they were sometimes known, which could only receive messages, not send them. Vicky said the guy knew this and kept on taunting her for the better part of half an hour before things finally went silent. She then thought that it might have been safe to leave, and she slowly turned the lock on the bathroom door before opening slightly and peeking out to see if the guy was gone. He wasn't. He was just sitting on the little kitchen island in complete silence, staring at the bathroom door. He'd been waiting for her to come out. He didn't even rush to grab the door or anything either. Vicky just said that he'd started laughing again, saying that he didn't have to rush, that he'd wait there all night if he needed to. She had to stay inside that locked bathroom for hours and hours before she finally felt safe enough to come out, and even then, she was completely gripped by the fear that the guy was lurking somewhere, waiting for her to come out. She walked back to the elevator with her high heel in hand, still hoping to use it as a weapon to defend herself. Then when she got down to the lobby, she burst into tears when the attendant asked her if everything was okay. That's when the cops were informed, and Vicky said they got to the building at around 5:30, which was the exact time that we'd been leaving the office. Still worried about her. It made me sick thinking that, for that brief time when we'd been mildly frustrated with her supposed tardiness, she'd been trapped in the bathroom by some complete psycho whose idea of fun was scaring the hell out of some poor innocent young woman. Then by the time we realized something was wrong, it could have been far, far too late. Vicky said to me, and she told the cops this too, that she really did think that's all he was interested in doing. I mean, if he really wanted to, and he might have taken a few hits from that high heel before it happened, but that guy could have overpowered her, opened up that window and shoved her out. Or not even that. He could have just attacked her when she wasn't expecting it, and she might never have left that apartment alive. But that's just the thing. He didn't. He liked the idea that she was afraid. That's what made him laugh so hard. That's what got him off. I can't imagine how harrowing of an experience that was for poor Vicky, but incredibly, she was back to work in just a few days. She said she realized that if his whole thing was to make her afraid, then cowering at home would be exactly what he wanted her to do. Her only frustration was that the cops never caught up with the guy. He would have only been charged with harassment and maybe issuing a deadly threat or something, and probably would have just gotten away with a misdemeanor. But still, it would have been some small amount of justice for all the terror that he put Vicky through. To me, it's frustrating to know that people like that exist in the first place. I can't even imagine how sick in the head a person has to be able to list tricking and terrorizing random women as one of their hobbies. I just hope karma caught up to him one day, and it caught up to him hard. Before I officially started up my business, I used to work as like a general handyman, and on a very casual basis too. I was fresh out of the county and determined to turn myself around, but I barely had 2 cents to my name, so I just started hustling with whatever I could get my hands on. And about 6 months after, I had my own van, my own tools, and I had everything except a contractor's license. But that sure as hell didn't stop me from building my business and growing my revenue. And about a year later, I was basically working on retainer for a landlord who operated multiple different properties across the city. Some were in nice areas, some were in not so nice areas, and I wasn't actually on retainer. We just joked that he gave me so much work that I might as well have been. Anyway, one day he asked me if I could fit some veneers on some old cabinets, so I tell him sure. Get the address of the place that he wants me to visit, then headed over the very next morning to get it done. The tenant of the apartment I was working on had been asked to vacate while the work was going on, So I was free to do my thing, which for the most part consisted of applying a super strong adhesive to the cabinets before carefully fitting the veneers. I was about halfway through the job when I heard the key turning in the lock of the apartment's door. I waited until the tenant was within earshot, then called out an apology for the smell of the glue, which by that stage was still real strong and thick in the air. A second or so later, a woman of maybe 35 to 40 appeared in the doorway, and she looked at me with these big, wild eyes before asking me, "Where is it?" I was still halfway up a ladder at the time, so I'm halfway turned around on it when I ask her back, "Where's what?" Instead of answering me, she got really angry all of a sudden, stomped her way to the center of the room and told me word for word, "Tell me, or I'll kick you off that effing ladder." I start feeling incredibly vulnerable after that, so I start climbing down real fast in the hopes that she was only bluffing, or if she does kick the ladder, then I'll have less of a fall and less chance to really hurt myself. I expected some kind of confrontation when I got to the ground, so I can feel my adrenaline start kicking in as I stepped off that bottom rung and turned to face her. But by the time I did, she was gone. Gone in the sense that she was no longer in front of me, and gone in the sense that whoever I had just been talking to was gone too. She dropped to her knees, grabbed the open tube of adhesive that I'd been using, and started to sniff up these deep huffs of the fumes into her nose. I must have asked her something like, "What the hell, lady?" and then reached down to take her by the shoulder to try to pull her away from it. But the second I touched her, she turned and there was a totally different person looking back at me. The lady that walked into her apartment had been rude and confrontational, but the lady staring back at me now looked like she could have ripped out my liver, eaten it raw, and then asked for seconds. She screamed, "Get your effing hands off of me," shoved me, then went right back to huffing the tube of industrial-strength adhesive that I had sitting at the bottom of the ladder. And I'm serious when I say it was like a transformation. Her eyes were different, still angry but full of something else too. She was like a mountain lion if a person got too close to her cubs, completely rabid, and even though she was small enough for me to toss, I got to admit that in that moment, I was goddamn terrified. She kept on huffing and puffing on that tube of glue until all that rage just seemed to wash away from her. Then when she was done, and with the tube of glue still in her hand, she got up, walked over to her couch, and just plopped herself down and lay there looking all blissed out like she didn't even know where she was. I remember telling her that I was going to get my stuff and put it in the van and get the hell out of there, and that she'd have to deal with her landlord if she wanted the rest of the cabinet veneers fitted. She just groaned at me and waved her arm as if to say, "Just go away already." And so I did. With her lying there like a zombie, I packed up my stuff and got the hell out of there before she decided that she wanted to help herself to the rest of my gear. I left her with that tube of adhesive too. That stuff can be expensive, but there was no way that I was about to risk getting my face ripped off by trying to pull it out of her hand. So I pack up my gear, trying to carry as much as possible out to the van just in case the glue-sniffing tenant decided to steal something. I managed to get everything except my ladder under my arms, then on the way out, I started hearing this kid crying. There's no telling how long they'd been wailing, but I guess I just filtered it out into background noise while I was trying to keep from getting shredded by that crazy glue sniffer lady. But then when I step outside, I see where the crying was coming from. There was a car right there on the curb with both the driver's side and rear passenger door open. In the back, there was a kid still strapped into the car seat, and it was screaming out, "Mommy, Mommy," over and over again. There were grocery bags sat in the pathway to the apartment too, like the woman had gotten home, saw the van and rushed inside after abandoning both her grocery bags and her kid. Maybe she just forgot that I was stopping by that day and rushed inside to check it out before bringing her kid and groceries inside. I'm not sure. But either way, she walked in, the smell of the adhesives hit her, and then that's all that she had in her mind. And that was the scariest thing of all. Way scarier than the prospect of getting my face chewed off by this crazy lady. This woman was such a degenerate drug addict that one little whiff of industrial strength adhesive and she was gone. Hell, she might have been Mother of the Year before she walked into that room, and then just boom, she was just right back to the bottom of the barrel, getting high all over again. I don't honestly know what her situation was, and I shouldn't speculate. I just hope her kid ended up okay, because with a mother like that, life sure is gonna be an uphill struggle. After I got out of the Marine Corps, I found a job working for a property management company as their resident knuckle dragger. I'd move furniture, perform small DIY jobs, and occasionally I'd be called in to help clean out the apartment of some scumbag tenant who trashed the place either deliberately or through their sad excuse for a lifestyle. The single worst one I'd ever had was a small rental home on a real nice street in a real nice neighborhood. My employer had already called to warn me that it was bad. She'd only taken a few steps in before the smell turned her around, and she knew that it had to be bad in there, maybe even dead body bad, so she called me in to help the usual cleaning crew. I drove over, met up with Rosa, shout out to the nicest Filipina cleaning lady, and then I went in first to make sure that there were no dead bodies inside. I knew next to nothing about the previous tenants at the time, only that they'd disappeared after going delinquent on their rent. I bust in, search all the rooms, and the place is absolutely disgusting, but I was confident that there were no corpses inside, so I told Rosa and the girls that it was safe to go inside. The only thing was, they need to put on as much safety gear as possible. Vicks under the noses, the whole 9 yards. Because inside one of the upstairs bedrooms was a huge stack of used diapers. I don't mean a stack of as in 5 or 6 piled in a corner or something. I'm talking a pyramid-shaped pile that was at least waist-high, and I'm not exaggerating at all there. The division of labor was such that anything big and heavy that needed to be moved out, that was down to me. But anything that could be moved by hand, which included the diaper pile, was down to Rosa and the girls. So other than catching a glimpse of it, I didn't get to grips with the diaper pyramid, and I only heard Rosa and the girls making passing comments about it, one which was such a big baby. Now, me with my low IQ self assumed that we're talking about either the size of this kid's dumps or the sheer number of diapers in that pile. I guess that in my wildest, most disturbing dreams I never would have guessed exactly what that lady meant when she said big baby. It was only afterwards, when I talked to the employer, that I actually realized what had been going on in that house. I mentioned something about being no place to keep a kid, in such a filthy, disgusting place and all. My employer was like, "Huh? Family?" The rental had been a single occupancy, just this one lone dude, and the comment about the big baby, it's because those diapers were adult-sized. The guy had been filling those diapers, taking them off, and then just tossing them into the pile in the same freaking room that he slept in. And I don't know about you, but that's probably the most disgusting, disturbing thing I can possibly conceive of. I don't know what happened to that guy, nor do I really want to know. I just hope that he's got some help, because Lord knows that his stinky butt needs it. This all happened to my dad way back when I was a kid, so I have no memory of it whatsoever, and all I have to go on is what he's told me. But here goes. When I was younger, my mom and dad were in a kind of precarious financial situation, so we rented out the second floor of what was quite a large house to this older lady named June. Well, one day, she starts getting behind on her rent, and my parents understanding at first, but after a while, she started acting more and more squirrely, as they put it, and the relationship between her and my parents got worse and worse. At first, it was just excuses as to why she didn't have the rent. After that, she got more and more aggressive every time my dad brought the subject up. In the end, she owed 4 months' worth of rent when my parents finally decided that they couldn't have June living there anymore. It wasn't an easy decision either. They'd started off really liking each other, but the situation had just soured over time. So then, one day, Dad goes to confront her and tells her that they want her to move out. Dad says he was expecting quite a confrontation, but to his surprise, June said she had the cash for 2 months of back rent and promised to get him the rest by the end of the following month. My dad said that this was obviously a welcome turn of events, and he accepted June's invitation to come up to her half of the house so she could give him the cash. She asked him to wait on the landing, which was decorated as a kind of sitting area with a coffee table and a few chairs, then she went off to get the money. Dad said that he waited for a little while, then as time started to drag on, he got more and more impatient. He went off looking for June, but he found that she'd locked herself in her bedroom. Dad asks what's going on, but June says everything's fine, and she's just looking for the cash. Dad asks why she'd locked the door, but she repeats that she's looking for the cash and that everything is fine. Dad then waits some more, growing more and more frustrated, but the next time he calls June's name, she won't reply. Dad then puts his ear to the door because he can hear whispering, and he's almost certain that he hears her saying, "Help me, please. I'm trapped in here." It takes Dad a second or two to figure out what's going on, and he said at first he started asking her, "Are you okay in there? What's going on?" But again, she doesn't answer him. Dad said he was thinking, who the hell is she talking to? But then a minute later, it dawned on him. She's talking on the phone, and by the sounds of it, there's a good chance the person she's talking to is a 911 operator. Dad's suspicions were confirmed a few minutes later when he heard sirens in the street outside, and he went out to meet the cops to explain how it was all just some kind of false alarm. The cops said that June said that she had been violently assaulted by the homeowner, i.e. my dad. But since that wasn't remotely true, he was only too happy to allow them entry into our home. Dad showed them up onto the landing, how there were no signs of any struggle or anything, and then directed them to the room where June was held up. Once she heard the cops were there, June opened the door, but only allowed them entry into the room and not my dad. Minutes later, the cops came out again, saying to Dad, "You're not under arrest right now, but she needs more medical attention," referring to June. My dad panics and once again explains to the cops that he didn't hit her, and that he's genuinely stunned at how she'd gotten hurt when just moments before she'd been fine. But then the cops are all chill with him and explain they know that he hadn't hit her because they can clearly see where this lady had been bashing her head with something blunt in the same place over and over again. The lady said Dad punched her, and there was no way those wounds came from punches unless my dad was wearing a brass knuckle or something. And after talking to my mom, who had been sitting downstairs the whole time and had heard nothing, they let the EMTs take the lady to the hospital, then waited a few days before telling her that there was no case against my dad. They didn't charge her with a false report, which made my mom really angry, but it did give my dad enough leverage to get her gone once and for all. He said if she hadn't moved out by the end of the month, he was going to sue her for filing a false police report against him. Dad said that he wasn't even sure how that'd work, but he sure as hell scared that lady enough that she packed up and found somewhere else to live. I have a vague memory of this woman, but no memory of all the drama that unfolded. But my mom and dad say it was a particularly stressful time in their early parenting days. After all, they were sleeping in the same house as some obviously crazy woman with her kid who was still only like 3 or 4 years old at the time. And it kind of creeps me out to think about sometimes too, because if she'd do that kind of thing to herself, who knows what she would have done to us if the urge had suddenly taken her. Many years ago now, back when I was in college, I worked as the property manager at a 100-unit apartment complex here in Charleston. It was a pretty awesome job, in that I had all my rent covered by the company, and the only truly taxing things they expected of me consisted of filling out paperwork and scheduling the maintenance workers. The place had a pretty even mix of tenants. There were a lot of college kids, along with a bunch of post-grad singles and roommates and the occasional young family, too. But there was one guy that I always felt kind of sorry for. He didn't seem to have any family, and I think that he might have been on disability, but he kept to himself, and the most I ever saw of him was when he was walking to a nearby convenience store around once or twice a week. Around June of my second year there, I got a call from one of the tenants in his building, complaining that there was a funky odor coming from his apartment. I went in, and it smelled kind of like someone had puked in the hall, and seeing as there was a handful of college kids in that building, that was actually a pretty depressing and common occurrence. We had the carpet shampooed the next day. Then the cleaners used a bunch of that industrial-strength shake-and vac that always makes the place smell like a hotel. Once that was done, I honestly figured that'd be the end of it. But then I think that it was maybe 3 or 4 days after, I get calls from half a dozen other tenants saying that the smell had only gotten worse. I remember being sat in my car, trying to figure out just what the hell was going on when suddenly my cell phone started buzzing. Remember the sickly-looking loner that I just told you about? The one who I only saw walk over to the store every so often? Well, the person calling me turned out to be that guy's daughter, calling all the way over from Michigan. Her dad hadn't answered his phone in a few weeks, and she was getting kind of worried about him, and could I go over and check on him to make sure that he just lost his cell phone while on D&D or whatever. I said that I'd oblige her, then head over to his building again just to do that. As I'm walking, I put 2 and 2 together. It's summer, there's a bad smell in the building, and my sickly-looking loner hadn't been heard from in a while. I immediately called my on-duty maintenance guy and told him about the call, and he too thinks that we're both about to have a really bad day. We met up, walked up to the guy's floor, and sure enough, the smell hits us like an absolute freight train. Then, when we managed to get the door of the loner's apartment open, the smell is considerably stronger. We knocked on the door a few times, and to this day I'm not entirely sure why we did that. I guess it was just one final grasp at home before we had to deal with the reality in front of it. But when we got no answer, I opened the door and all we could hear was the non-stop buzz of all the flies in the apartment. I immediately slammed the door, walked out of the building with the maintenance guy behind me, and we slowly figured out a plan of action. Then within the hour, the cops were on the scene, closely followed by the fire department and eventually the county coroner. Apparently the guy died from some sort of natural causes probably 3 to 4 weeks earlier, and by that time, the temperature was regularly in the 90s outside, so in an apartment with no AC, it was cooking this guy at about 100 to 110 degrees. He was practically a puddle by the time we got to him. The cost to recover the apartment was close to $30,000. It was stripped down to the studs. Every thread of carpet, every appliance, every cabinet, every hunk of drywall, it all got torn out and replaced. That whole ordeal is how I found out that there are actually specialist cleaning companies who specialize in the cleaning of human remains, and I also learned that they don't come cheap. Even after that, there was always a faint odor in the apartment, and trying to get it filled again was an ordeal all unto itself. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description all down below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, love makes the world go round.